In a luxurious restaurant, a billionaire decided to mock a simple waitress in front of his friends, asking her to give an opinion on a $40 billion deal. What should have been just an arrogant joke ended the moment she replied with 5 words that made the entire table fall into absolute silence. No one imagined that the woman serving coffee hid a past capable of toppling a financial empire built on lies. And that night, a truth buried for years was about to come to light, with consequences that no one there could predict. Before discovering how a simple question changed the fate of millionaires and revealed a gigantic fraud, subscribe to the channel and prepare yourself for a story of intelligence, revenge, and justice that will leave you speechless. Thursday night fell over Brigadeiro Faria Lima Avenue like a second skin of neon and thin smoke. Inside Eclat, the most exclusive restaurant in the capital of São Paulo, nestled on the 50th floor of a glass and steel tower in Villa Olympia, the discreet sound of silver cutlery against imported porcelain mixed with the contained murmur of deals worth fortunes. Eclat was not a place for those who had money. It was a place for those who had enough power to make money wait outside. Valentina Suarez crossed the main hall, carrying a champagne tray with the exact posture of someone who had learned how not to be seen. 36 years old, brown hair tied in a severe bun, immaculate black uniform, steps calibrated to make no noise. She knew exactly how many steps separated the kitchen from table 12, how many seconds it took to fill a glass without spilling a drop, and how to slightly tilt her head so that customers felt attended to without having to actually look at her. Invisibility was an art. She had spent 3 years perfecting it. Table 12 was occupied by Augusto Ramos Cavalcanti, 62 years old, founder and president of the Cavalcanti Group, one of the largest infrastructure and energy conglomerates in the country. Around him, a circle of executives with loosened ties and wide smiles celebrated what seemed to be an important achievement. Valentina served the glasses without raising her eyes above the level of their hands, but her ears recorded everything with surgical precision. 42 billion, Augusto said, lightly tapping his open palm on the table. This acquisition will put us on another level. Nexum is the jewel of the Brazilian technological sector. Do you know what it means to control the digital infrastructure of 12 states? The others nodded with enthusiasm. Valentina recognized some faces. Diego Furtado, the group's legal director, Clarissa Wendt, responsible for the risk management area, and Helio Braga, Augusto's personal financial advisor for over a decade. There were also 2 men she did not recognize, probably representatives from the other side of the deal. She finished serving and stepped back 2 paces, positioning herself near the marble column that divided the hall, ready to return when necessary. She had arrived at Eclat by accident, or by what seemed like an accident at the time. 18 months earlier, upon leaving a previous job at a neighborhood cafe in Ipiranga, she had passed in front of a hiring sign posted on the service door of a commercial building on Faria Lima. The interview had lasted 15 minutes. The human resources manager had asked about experience in fine dining service, and Valentina had mentioned an internship period that had actually existed years before when she was still a student and worked to pay for college. The rest had been built on that real foundation, not entirely lies but selected truths, which was the most sustainable way to maintain a parallel identity. Eclat had proven over time to be a privileged observation post. Customers spoke freely in front of the waiters, not out of carelessness, but out of a deep-seated belief that the service staff possessed neither the vocabulary nor the interest to decode what was being discussed. Valentina had heard over 18 months conversations involving names, numbers, and structures that she recognized from her previous time. She had mentally catalogued everything, without knowing exactly what she would do with it, sustained by the vague conviction that accumulated information was more valuable than wasted information. On that Thursday, when table 12 began to fill with faces she recognized, something changed in the quality of her attention. It wasn't alarm, it was the precise adjustment of an instrument that had been on standby for too long. It was then that the comment changed everything. Diego Furtado, with his second glass of champagne already in hand, pointed to Valentina with a casual gesture and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Hey, Augusto, since everyone has an opinion on this deal, how about hearing what our waitress thinks? She must have a unique perspective. The laughter that followed was the kind that doesn't need to be funny to exist. The implicit hierarchy in the gesture was enough. Augusto Cavalcanti looked at her with the eyes of someone about to participate in a harmless joke. It's true. Come here, young lady. What does someone who serves coffee think about a 42 billion acquisition? Valentina did not move for 2 whole seconds. In those 2 seconds, she calculated everything. She calculated the risk, calculated the exposure, calculated the price of silence and the price of speaking. And then, for the first time in 3 years, she decided that the price of silence was too high. She walked to the table and said in a firm and low voice, "This is a trap for you." The laughter died before it finished. Augusto Cavalcanti raised an eyebrow. Diego Furtado set down his glass. Clarissa went, slowly crossed her arms. "What?" Augusto said, more with curiosity than irritation. "Nexum looks valuable on paper," Valentina said, maintaining the calm tone of someone describing the menu, "but its real assets have been transferred to a parallel structure over the last 18 months. What remains are overvalued assets and hidden liabilities that you will inherit the moment you sign the acquisition." The silence that settled over table 12 was different from the elegant silence that normally inhabited Eclat. It was the silence of someone who just realized that the ground beneath their feet might not be solid. Augusto Cavalcanti looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his executives, none of whom said a word. Then he turned his eyes back to her. "Who are you?" Valentina took a deep breath. "Someone who has seen this pattern before," she said, "and someone who knows exactly how it ends." Augusto stood up slowly, buttoned his jacket, and said to Diego, without taking his eyes off her, "Cancel the rest of the table. I want to speak with this woman in my office now." Helio Braga opened his mouth to protest. Augusto silenced him with a single look. Valentina placed the tray on the table carefully, as if she were finishing just another ordinary shift. Inside, she felt her heart beating at a rhythm she hadn't known for 3 years, the rhythm of adrenaline, of analysis, of real danger. She had spent 3 years waiting for an opportunity like this. She just hadn't imagined it would arrive on an ordinary Thursday, on the 50th floor of a restaurant where she served champagne to people who didn't even learn her name. But that was how great turnarounds began. Not with fanfare, but with 5 words said at the right time to the right person. As she followed Augusto Cavalcanti toward the private elevator, Valentina did not look back. There was nothing to see, only the abandoned tray and the glasses that were still bubbling, as if the champagne didn't know that the toast had just changed meaning. Augusto Cavalcanti's office occupied half of the 49th floor of the tower, separated from the restaurant by a single internal staircase clad in dark oak. It was a space that communicated power without needing to shout. Glass walls facing the city, a desk that looked carved from a single block of stone, and screens showing real-time market data even at this hour of the night. Valentina entered and stood still in the center of the room, standing without waiting for an invitation to sit. Augusto went straight to the desk, activated something on his tablet, and looked at her with an expression that balanced distrust and curiosity in equal proportions. "You have 10 minutes to convince me that you are not crazy or ill-intentioned," he said. "After that, I decide what to do with what you said." "I don't need 10 minutes, Valentina replied. "I need access to Nexum's due diligence documents." Augusto crossed his arms. "That is not something I show to a restaurant employee." "I know," she said, "but you are about to lose between 8 and 12 billion reais in assets that will evaporate in the first 90 days after the acquisition. If you want to believe me, I need access. If you don't, you can put me in the elevator now, and I'll spend the rest of the night washing glasses." There was a coldness in her that did not fit with the uniform she was still wearing. Augusto noticed this. He studied her for a moment longer and then turned to the larger screen, opened an encrypted folder, and rotated the monitor toward her. "Show me what you see." Augusto went to the sidebar in the office, a discreet piece of furniture with some bottles of Scotch whiskey that he obviously did not offer to her, but which he clearly used as a thinking ritual. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey, did not drink immediately, and stood holding the glass while processing what he had heard. "You spent 3 years in a restaurant," he said finally. more as an attempt to fix reality than as a question. 18 months in this one specifically, Valentina said. Before that, 2 other jobs in smaller services. I built it gradually. It makes no sense to appear directly in high-exposure places with a new identity. The risk of crossing paths with someone who knew me was too high in the beginning. And during that time you were accumulating evidence. I was organizing what I already had and waiting for new evidence to emerge. What I had from the beginning was the backup, the files I copied before Renato realized I had discovered the scheme. But isolated files don't build a case. I needed context, correspondence between what I possessed and what was happening in the market. A pause. And I needed a moment when the operation was active enough to be demonstrable, but not so advanced that it couldn't be interrupted. Augusto finally drank the whiskey slowly. You found that moment tonight. Tonight found me, she said. There is a difference. It was a small and at the same time essential distinction. Valentina had learned over the 3 years that there were 2 types of preparation. The one that actively seeks the opportunity and the one that makes it possible when it arrives. She had practiced the second because she knew the first could lead her to act before being ready, or in contexts that did not offer the necessary protections. Valentina approached the desk and began analyzing the documents with a speed that made Augusto straighten up in his chair. She didn't read. She scanned the pages like someone who already knows what they are looking for and only needs to confirm the exact location. Here, she said, pointing to a line on a balance sheet. This asset, the data processing platform called Nexum Core, is listed as wholly owned by the company. But if you cross-reference it with the IP registration filed at the NPI base 18 months ago, you will find that the rights were transferred to a company called Waitress Soluções. Who is Waitress? Augusto frowned. I've never heard of it. No one has. That is its function. Valentina continued flipping through the pages. Waitress was incorporated as a shell company in a corporate structure with 3 layers of holdings. The real ownership of Nexum's assets is there. What you are going to buy for 42 billion is basically a shell with embedded debts and service provision contracts that depend on annual renewal with Waitress itself, which will charge whatever price it wants because it will hold the technology that powers everything. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It was the silence of someone who is recalculating. How do you know all this? Valentina paused for a moment. The time had come to open the first layer. Not all of them, not yet. Because the model used in this operation has a specific origin, she said, and I know that origin better than any living person. Augusto stood up and walked to the window. São Paulo blinked below in millions of points of light, indifferent. Are you from the sector? I was, she said. 3 years ago, I was a senior analyst of risk structures in merger and acquisition operations. I worked on some of the largest deals in the Brazilian market. She paused. Until someone decided I knew too much. Augusto turned around. What happened? That is the part that will take more than 10 minutes. She pointed to the chair in front of the desk. May I sit? For the first time since they had entered the office, something close to a smile crossed Augusto Cavalcanti's face. He gestured toward the chair. Please. Valentina sat with the posture she had learned not in the restaurant, but years before, in boardrooms where every movement was read as a sign of confidence or weakness. My real name doesn't matter yet, she said. What matters is that I worked for 4 years for a man named Renato Salave, founding partner of Salave and Associados, one of the most influential financial advisory boutiques in the country. Augusto showed no reaction to the name, which was in itself a piece of information. Valentina continued. Renato hired me as a junior analyst and promoted me quickly because I had a specific skill, creating financial structure models that were at the same time legally defensible and extraordinarily efficient for transferring assets between entities. It wasn't illegal. It was sophisticated financial architecture. She breathed. The problem was when I realized that some of these models were being used in contexts I hadn't authorized, and for purposes that were certainly not what I had conceived. You discovered he was using your models to structure frauds. Not immediately. It took me time to assemble the full picture. By the time I did, it was too late. She crossed her hands on the desk. Renato knew I had found out. Instead of confronting me, he was more elegant. He planted evidence that I had actively participated in the irregular operations. When the regulatory authorities initiated an investigation, the dossier they found had my name on every relevant document. His was carefully absent. Augusto remained motionless. "And you fled." "I disappeared," she corrected precisely. "There is a difference. Fleeing implies guilt. Disappearing was the only way to buy time to build my own defense without being neutralized before finishing. And this model being used in the Nexum operation is mine," she said, "with superficial modifications to make tracking difficult, but the core architecture is identical to the system I developed in the 3rd year I worked with Renato Salave. I recognize every logical line as if they were my own strokes in a sketch." She looked directly at Augusto. "Which means Renato is behind this, and that someone inside your company is collaborating with him." The air in the office seemed to grow denser. Augusto Cavalcanti was not a man who let himself be shaken easily. Decades in the market had built considerable armor. But there was something in her objectivity, in the precision with which each word fit into the next, that made it impossible to dismiss her as fantasy or manipulation. He walked to the intercom and said, "Marcos, I need you to come up. Now." Valentina waited, with her hands quiet on the desk and her eyes on the city outside. She had spent 3 years in that position, waiting, observing, calculating. The difference was that this time, for the first time in a long time, she was not waiting alone. Marcos Albuquerque arrived in less than 4 minutes, which said a lot about the nature of his work. 50 years old, broad shoulders, permanently neutral expression. He was the corporate security chief of the Cavalcanti Group, a man who had spent 15 years in forensic auditing before migrating to the private sector. When he entered and found Augusto standing and a woman in a waitress uniform sitting at the meeting table, his expression did not change at all. "Marcos, I need you to check something right now." Augusto turned the monitor toward the security chief. "I want to know everything that exists about a company called Waitress Soluções, incorporation, partners, registered movements, any link with Nexum or people connected to Nexum." Marcos nodded and opened the laptop he carried with him. Valentina watched as he navigated through systems she recognized: corporate databases, Board of Trade records, CNPJ cross-references. He was good, but she was better. "I can help direct the search," she said. Marcos raised his eyes to her without changing his expression. "Who is she?" "Someone who knows more about this deal than anyone in this room," Augusto said. "Collaborate." It wasn't exactly a compliment, but it was enough. Valentina approached and, without touching Marcos's keyboard, began to indicate specific search fields. "Look for the exact corporate name, Waitress Soluções M Tecnologia Limitada, registered in São Paulo, between 28 and 32 months ago. The nominal partners will be front men. Look for the technical administrators, not the formal owners. That's where you'll find the real connection." Marcos typed. In a few minutes, the screen showed the record. The company had been incorporated 31 months earlier. 2 nominal partners with no relevant history in the sector. But the registered technical administrator was a legal entity, a holding company called Meridian Capital Advisors. Valentina felt something tighten in her chest when the name appeared. "Meridian," she said softly. "Do you know it?" Augusto asked. "It's the structure Renato Salave has used to operate since he closed Salave and Associados." She took a deep breath. "He no longer acts under his own name. He operates through a network of entities. Meridian is the central node." Marcos crossed 2 more records and raised his eyes to Augusto. "She's right. Meridian appears as the controller of 3 other companies that provide services to Nexum: technology services, strategic consulting, and contract management." Valentina stared at the screen for a long moment after the name Meridian appeared. There was something almost physical in the reaction, not exactly surprise, because she had always suspected Renato operated through such structures, but the confirmation that the suspicion and the reality coincided had a specific texture. It was the texture of 3 years of hypothesis becoming verifiable fact. "May I use the keyboard for a moment?" she said to Marcos. He stepped back slightly. Valentina typed a sequence of searches that were not obvious. Not the first searches any analyst would do, but the second and third ones, the ones made after understanding that the surface data was designed to look complete. She looked for the names of Meridian's technical administrators in other databases, cross-referenced them with legal representation records, and checked if there was any archived administrative process that mentioned the holding. She found something Marcos hadn't found: an administrative process opened and then archived for lack of evidence 2 years earlier at the Council for Control of Financial Activities. The process had been initiated by an anonymous report and closed without a conclusion. But the rapporteur had recorded in the archived records that Meridian's structure presented characteristics consistent with a vehicle company for asset transfer operations of difficult tracking. "Someone tried before," she said, pointing to the record. Marcos read the note. "And they didn't succeed." "Because they didn't have what I have," Valentina said. "It wasn't arrogance, it was inventory." What she possessed was the internal understanding of the architecture, the knowledge of how the system had been conceived before being transformed into an instrument for something else. It was like knowing the original floor plan of a building that had been renovated to hide secret compartments. Most people would only see the renovation. She saw the plan underneath. The web was beginning to take visible shape. Augusto leaned on the table with both hands. "What exactly happens if I close this deal?" Valentina replied without hesitation. "You acquire Nexum at full value. In the first 45 days, the service provision contracts with the Meridian network companies are renewed with automatic adjustment clauses. In 90 days, the hidden liabilities embedded in the debt structure begin to fall due. These are obligations that were contracted in Nexum's name, but registered in second-level subsidiaries that you will inherit without having listed them on the due diligence radar. The company's cash flow begins to bleed, and meanwhile, someone, Renato or someone acting for him, launches an aggressive short position on Cavalcanti Group shares in the market. The perception that you made a bad acquisition weakens the stock. With the group weakened, a hostile takeover bid appears for your strategic assets, probably the energy concessions, which are the real target of all this." The silence that settled was different from all the previous ones. It was the silence of someone looking at the map of an ambush they were about to walk straight into. "Clarissa went," Augusto said suddenly. "She is the one responsible for the Nexum due diligence process." Valentina said nothing. She waited. "You are implying she might be involved." "I am not implying anything," Valentina said carefully. "I am saying that the fraud model being applied here requires internal collaboration. Someone with access to the due diligence needed to ensure the hidden liabilities were not detected." "Who had full access to the documents in the last 6 months?" Marcos was already typing. "The risk management area, Clarissa and her team." Augusto remained motionless for a moment. Valentina knew what was happening inside him. The natural resistance of someone about to accept that someone trusted might have betrayed them. It was a process she knew intimately because she had gone through it with Renato. "I need proof before accusing someone," he said. "I know," Valentina said, "and that's why I need more access. Not to the public documents, to the internal communication records and the access logs to the due diligence system. If Clarissa was contacted by the Meridian network, there will be a trail." Augusto looked at Marcos. The security chief nodded slightly, a small gesture, but one that meant he also saw coherence in what was being presented. "You will have the access," Augusto said, "but I want Marcos to supervise everything, and I want to know who I'm really dealing with. Name, history, everything." Valentina knew this moment would come. She had mentally rehearsed several versions of how she would respond. In the end, she chose the most direct. "My name is Valentina Suarez. I was a senior risk structure analyst until 3 years ago, when I was formally accused of participating in irregularities in a regulatory process conducted by the CVM. The accusation was framed by Renato Salave to neutralize me after I discovered what he was doing. Since then, I have lived under an altered identity and worked in this restaurant while accumulating evidence." She paused. "I have an encrypted backup with documentation that demonstrates my innocence and the real origin of the financial structures that were attributed to me. I haven't presented it to the authorities yet Because Renato has connections that can compromise any investigation before it gets far enough. Augusto studied her for a long moment. Why now? Why tonight? Because tonight was the first time in 3 years that I saw the pattern being applied again, live, in real time. And there was someone in the room with enough power to interrupt it before it went too far. She looked at him directly. You mocked me an hour ago, but you were also the only one at the table who stopped laughing when I spoke. Augusto Cavalcanti was silent for a moment. Then he said, more to himself than to her, 42 billion. And the energy concessions, she completed. That was the final prize. Marcos closed the laptop and looked at Augusto. What do you want me to do? Augusto straightened up. When he spoke, his voice had the texture of a decision made. I want the access logs to the due diligence system from the last 48 hours, and I want to locate Clarissa Wendt, where she is now, what she is doing. He turned to Valentina. And you are going to show me exactly what is in that backup. Valentina nodded. The night had completely changed in nature. She was no longer a waitress who had said something inconvenient. She was the only person in that building who knew where all the pieces on the board were, and Renato Salave still didn't know she had stood up. The access logs arrived at 2 in the morning. Marcos pulled them directly from the group's internal servers with the kind of silent efficiency that comes from years of dealing with situations that cannot be documented in a conventional way. Valentina stood beside him as the registry lines appeared on the screen, and she was the one who first saw what she was looking for. Here, she said, pointing to a sequence of entries in the system made at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, 3 weeks earlier. This access was made outside of business hours, using Clarissa's credentials, but the source IP address does not match either the office or the corporate VPN. Marcos leaned over the screen. External IP, not registered in the systems. Someone used her credentials to access and modify the metadata of 3 specific files in the Nexum dossier. They didn't change the visible content, just the version metadata, so it would look like these documents had never been revised, when in fact they had been replaced. Augusto, who had been standing at the back of the room for the last hour, walked to the screen. What was in those files originally? Probably the real records of asset transfers to Vertis, Valentina said. The documents in the dossier now are clean versions, without the compromising transactions. Someone replaced the originals with edited versions and used Clarissa's credentials to make it look like she was the one who did the final review. So Clarissa might not be directly involved, Marcos said. Or she might have provided the credentials voluntarily, Valentina said. We don't know yet. What we do know is that the access was made and that there is a digital trail connecting this modification to someone from the outside. Augusto stepped away from the screen and walked to the window. The city below was quieter now, but not completely silent. São Paulo never was. I need to confront Clarissa. Not yet, Valentina said. If she is involved and realizes she's been discovered, she will warn Renato, and he will close the whole structure before we get what we need. If she is innocent, confronting her will only create noise without a result. We first need one more thing. What? Communication. If Renato or someone from the Meridian network made contact with someone inside the group, there will be a record, corporate email, message, anything. I want to check the external communications received by the risk management area in the last 6 months. Marcos looked at Augusto, who nodded. In another 40 minutes they had access, and it was in less than 20 minutes that Valentina found what she was looking for. A series of 13 emails exchanged between an external domain account, apparently from a consulting firm called Baltica Assessoria, and Clarissa Wendt. The emails discussed what seemed to be technical guidance on the due diligence process, formulated in a general enough way to look like legitimate consulting. But Valentina recognized the language patterns immediately. This is Renato, she said. The terminology, the structure of the recommendations. He's telling Clarissa what not to include in the report, formulated as methodological suggestions so as not to raise suspicion. Can you prove it's him writing? Not directly yet, but I can demonstrate that the methodological suggestions correspond precisely to the omissions that created the holes in the dossier. and that the Baltica Accessoria domain account was registered 45 days before the start of the due diligence process. In other words, it was created specifically for this operation. Marcos made a note. Augusto was silent for a long moment. Did she know what she was doing? He said finally. It was a question that contained another within it. Did I choose poorly whom to trust? Valentina answered carefully. The emails are ambiguous enough that she could claim she interpreted them as legitimate consulting, but there is a detail in the 11th email. She scrolled to the message in question. Here, Baltica asks for explicit confirmation that certain records will not be included in the final report, and Clarissa replies with a single word, confirmed. The air left Augusto's lungs almost audibly. We need to confront her now, he said with a harder voice. Not yet, Valentina insisted. If we confront her now, she denies everything, and the digital trail we have is not yet sufficient for formal action. We need her to incriminate herself more conclusively, or to open the system voluntarily, believing she is in control of the situation. How? Valentina turned to him. You are going to call Clarissa and say you have doubts about a specific item in the dossier. You will ask her to come to the office tomorrow morning to review it personally. When she arrives, I will be here, but not as a waitress. I will be working with Marcos with access to the system, and while she tries to manage the situation, I will track in real time any communication she tries to make with the Meridian network. Marcos tilted his head. That could work. Augusto looked at Valentina for a long moment, the kind of look that evaluates not only what someone is saying, but what the person is. Did you plan this alone? All this strategy over 3 years? Valentina did not answer immediately. She thought of the 3 years of silence, of the nights she had replayed every detail of Renato's scheme while cleaning tables in a restaurant where no one knew her real name. I didn't plan this night specifically, she said. I planned to be ready when the opportunity appeared. Those are different things. Augusto nodded slowly. There was something in his gaze that had changed over the last few hours. It was no longer the look of someone evaluating a subordinate. It was the look of someone recognizing an equal. Tomorrow morning, at 8, he said. You will be here in different clothes. Valentina almost smiled. Yes, sir. It was almost 3 in the morning when she left the building and walked to the nearest bus stop. The cold São Paulo air at that hour had a specific quality, quiet, almost private, as if the city were thinking to itself. She boarded the first bus and stood, holding the bar, watching the points of light passing through the windows. Renato Salavi was still out there, confident. He didn't know she had stepped out of the shadows. He didn't know that in less than 12 hours, the trap he had built would begin to close in reverse. Valentina took a deep breath. There was a long day ahead. Clarissa Wendt arrived at Augusto's office at 8:17 in the morning, with a folder under her arm, and the expression of someone who spent the night preparing answers for questions they didn't yet know. She was 44 years old, blonde hair tied back with precision, grey suit, the perfect appearance of controlled competence. Valentina watched her through the security monitors, while Marcos monitored the system logs in real time. She accessed her email twice during the commute, Marcos said in a low voice, looking at the VPN connection log, and made a 3-minute call to a number that is not in the corporate contacts. Did you track the number? Not yet, but it's being done. Valentina nodded and focused on the screens. They were in a room adjacent to the main office, separated by a wall and by cameras transmitting what was happening on the other side. It was a setup Marcos had put together in less than 2 hours that morning, efficiency that impressed. In the room next door, Augusto received Clarissa with the habitual cordiality of an executive, holding his cards close to his chest. Clarissa, thank you for coming so early. A question has arisen that I need to clarify personally before we proceed with the signing. Clarissa sat down and opened the folder. Of course, Augusto, what is the doubt? These 3 assets here. He pointed to a printed list. Valentina had prepared that list. They were the exact files whose metadata had been altered in the nighttime access. I want to understand the methodology used to calculate their value in the consolidated balance sheet. Clarissa studied the list. Her expression did not change, but there was something in the way her eyes traveled over the paper, that Valentina, even from a distance, recognized. It was the look of someone checking if a trap had been activated. These assets were valued based on standard DCF methodology, with 5-year projections adjusted to the sector, Clarissa said. The report details everything in Section 4B. I read Section 4B, Augusto said. What I didn't find was the support documentation for the projections, the technical reports that back up the numbers. A microscopic pause. They must be in the digital attachments of the dossier. Marcos checked early today. They are not. Clarissa recomposed her expression quickly, but not quickly enough. There might have been an error in the upload. I can check right now. She opened the notebook she had brought and began to type. Valentina leaned over the monitors beside Marcos. Here it comes. On the access logs, it appeared in real time. Clarissa was trying to access the dossier repository, but not to check the missing attachments. She was navigating straight to the metadata of the 3 files in question. She is trying to check if the nighttime access was detected, Valentina said. And now? Marcos said. Now she is going to realize that the metadata was reverted to the originals this morning. Valentina had asked Marcos to do this at 6 in the morning, restore the original versions of the files before Clarissa arrived. She's going to see the real documents, with the asset transfer transactions that should have been removed. On the other side of the wall, Clarissa stopped typing. She sat motionless for a few seconds, the kind of immobility that happens when the ground disappears from under your feet. Then she closed the notebook slowly. Augusto, she said, with her voice slightly altered in tone, I need to tell you something. Valentina straightened up. Marcos paused the logs. I was contacted 6 months ago by a consulting firm called Baltica Assessoria, Clarissa began. They presented themselves as specialized in due diligence for technological operations and offered additional guidance for the process. It seemed legitimate. They had credentials, references, only... She stopped. Only what? Augusto said with the neutral voice of someone containing a lot. Some of the guidance they gave was to exclude certain records from the report. They said they were redundant data, that including them would create methodological confusion. I followed the guidance because I saw no reason not to. A pause. But when you mentioned the missing reports just now, I realized I was very naive, or too trusting in something I shouldn't have trusted. Did you unlock the original documents for me now? Augusto said. Clarissa opened the notebook again, accessed the system, and transferred the viewing permissions for the 3 files to Augusto's account. It's done. You will see what was really there. In the room next door, Valentina and Marcos were already seeing it. The original documents clearly showed the transfer of assets from Nexum to Vertice Soluções. Dates, values, digital signatures, everything. We have what we need, Marcos said. Valentina agreed, but there was something that still bothered her. Clarissa had confessed too quickly, with the convenience of someone who wants to position themselves as a victim before being accused. It could be genuine guilt. It could be strategy. For now, it didn't matter. What the document showed was enough to go to the next step. Augusto stood up and walked to the door of the adjacent room. Valentina and Marcos entered the main office. Clarissa raised her eyes and, upon seeing Valentina, frowned. Who is she? Someone who helped me understand what was happening, Augusto said. And who is going to help me understand the next step? Valentina looked at Clarissa directly. Baltica Assessoria is controlled by a holding company called Meridian Capital Advisors. Meridian operates as the structure of a businessman named Renato Salave. Do you know that name? Clarissa's expression changed, not with surprise, but with something that was trying not to be surprise, which said everything. You know it, Valentina said. It wasn't a question. Clarissa closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, there was something different in them. Not regret exactly, but the recognition that the game had ended before she had realized she was playing. He told me it was legitimate consulting, she said in a low voice. He says that to everyone, Valentina replied. It's part of the method. The news that Renato Salave had arrived at the building came at 10:40 in the morning, via the intercom from the 49th floor reception. He hadn't been called. He had simply appeared, with the specific confidence of someone accustomed to entering places without needing an invitation. Valentina was with her back to the door when Marcos received the communication. She felt something harden inside her. Not fear, but an acute concentration, the kind that happens when a situation stops being theoretical and becomes concrete. "He knows something has changed," she said. "Someone warned him." Marcos was already checking the communication records. Clarissa made a 22-second call at 9:53 to a number we have now identified as linked to Meridian. Valentina turned to Clarissa, who was sitting in a corner of the office with the expression of someone who had just realized the magnitude of the mistake they had made. "You called him." Clarissa did not answer immediately. Then, in a very low voice, "I panicked. I didn't know what to do." There was no time to deal with that now. Valentina turned to Augusto. "Renato is going to try to control the narrative. He knows the deal is at risk and will try to present a version of the facts that puts me as the threat. He will use my regulatory situation to discredit me. You need to be prepared for that. What do you need? For you to let me speak with him, not as a waitress, as Valentina Suarez." Augusto studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. Renato Salavi entered the office with the specific energy of someone who inhabits spaces of power. 60 years old, well-groomed grey hair, tailored suit, the posture of someone who never learned to doubt themselves. When his eyes met Valentina's, he stopped for a fraction of a second, so brief that someone who didn't know what to look for wouldn't have seen it. But Valentina saw it. "Augusto," he said with the warm voice of an old acquaintance, "I heard some doubts arose about the operation. I came personally because I value this relationship too much to let any misunderstanding take hold." "Misunderstanding is an interesting word," Augusto said without standing up. "Sit down, Renato." Renato sat, but his eyes returned to Valentina. "Who is this woman?" "Valentina Suarez," she said before Augusto could respond. "You remember me?" The silence that followed was the clearest possible confirmation. Renato recovered quickly. He was excellent at that. "Valentina." The name came out as if he were identifying something distant. "You are here as a fugitive from a regulatory process that you orchestrated," she said, with the calm of someone who spent 3 years waiting for this moment. "And I can demonstrate that." "That is a serious allegation." Renato turned to Augusto with the expression of someone asking for common sense. "Augusto, this woman was formally accused by the CVM of participating in financial irregularities. She is using you to try to rehabilitate herself." "Maybe," Augusto said. "Or maybe she's right. Let's see." He turned one of the monitors. "Do you know the company Waitress Soluções?" Renato's reaction was almost imperceptible, a slight tightening of the jaw. "Never heard of it." "Meridian Capital Advisors? One of the holdings in my investment network. What does that have to do?" "It controls Waitress," Valentina said, "and Waitress holds the real assets of Nexum that your team silently transferred over the last 18 months. The same assets that do not appear in the due diligence dossier, because someone instructed Clarissa Went to exclude them." Renato shifted his posture. The cordiality left his face like a removed mask. "You have no way of proving any of this. Any document you present will be questioned because of your legal situation." "You are right that my legal situation complicates things," Valentina said. "That's why I'm not going to use just new documents." She opened the notebook Marcos had prepared and rotated the screen toward the room. "I'm going to use something older." On the screen, a code structure appeared. Not computer code in the common sense, but the logical mapping of a complex financial architecture, schematized in flow diagrams that showed how assets could be transferred between entities in a way traceable only by someone who knew the internal structure. "This is the system I created," Valentina said. "I created it in my 3rd year working with you. It's in the backup I've kept since before you incriminated me." She slid to the next screen. "And this is the system being used in the Nexum operation. Side by side, you can see they are identical in the core architecture. The superficial modifications do not change the fundamental logic." Renato remained motionless. "What this demonstrates," Valentina continued, "is that the same person who created the original system is behind the current operation. And since I am the creator of the original system and can document when and how I created it, that means someone copied it and used it without my authorization, that someone was the only other person with full access to my work at that time. She looked at him directly. You. Renato Salave was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its previous warm texture. You don't have what you need for a legal action. Not yet, Valentina said, but I have enough for the Cavalcanti group to withdraw from the deal, notify the regulatory bodies, and present all this documentation as evidence of an attempted fraud in an acquisition operation, which opens an investigation into Waitress, Meridian, and their connections. A pause. And open investigations have a way of finding much more than the starting point. Renato stood up. He had lost control of the room, and he knew it. You are making a grave mistake. I've made mistakes before, Valentina said. The last one was trusting you. This isn't one. After Renato left, the room was silent for a considerable time. Clarissa was still sitting in the corner, looking at the floor. Augusto remained standing, his hand lightly resting on the table as if he needed an anchor. Marcos reviewed the logs in silence, without interrupting the moment. It was Valentina who spoke first, and not to anyone in particular, more like formulating a next step out loud. He is going to consult lawyers today. Before the end of the day, there will be a letter to the regulators trying to frame what happened here as a common commercial dispute, two sides of a negotiation that didn't reach an agreement, without recognition of any irregularity. Do you predict that based on what? Augusto said. Based on how he operated the last time, Valentina said. When the CVM investigation was opened against me, he didn't wait to be notified. He was proactive. He presented documentation voluntarily, positioned himself as a collaborator of the investigation, created the narrative before anyone else could create a different one. She looked at Augusto. It's effective. Most investigations start with the material that the most articulate party presents first. So we need to be faster than him. We need to be more precise, she corrected. Speed without precision only creates noise. What we are going to present needs to be complete enough so that the context is established before his version arrives. She turned to Marcos. How long to consolidate the evidence package in a format that the legal team can formally forward? If we work tonight, we'll have it by tomorrow morning. Valentina nodded. Then we work tonight. Augusto looked at her with an expression she had begun to recognize over the last few hours. Not admiration exactly, but something closer to the revision of a premise. He had started that night with a waitress who had said something inconvenient. He was ending it with someone who had mapped the problem, proposed the solution, and was organizing the execution with the same naturalness as someone who does this every week. When Renato left, the air in the office seemed lighter, as if a pressure that had been present without being named had finally been relieved. Augusto stood for a long moment, looking at the closed door. He's going to try to do something before the investigation begins, Marcos said. Yes, Valentina agreed. That's why we need to move faster than he expects. The days that followed were of an intensity Valentina hadn't experienced in years. She worked in the Cavalcanti Group's office, with full access to the financial systems, translating for Augusto and Marcos each layer of the structure that had been built around the Nexum operation. The documentation she had kept for 3 years, meticulously organized, encrypted, copied onto multiple devices, finally gained the function for which it had been prepared. The notification to the regulatory bodies was made within 48 hours. The CVM and the central bank received an evidence package that included the comparison of financial architectures, asset transfer records, emails from Baltica Assessoria, and the access logs to the due diligence system. The investigation was opened in less than a week, but Renato Salave did not stand still. Valentina knew this when, on the morning of the second week, Marcos entered the room where she was working and closed the door. We have a problem. She raised her eyes from the monitor. Someone is using a trading algorithm to accumulate short positions on Cavalcanti Group shares, discreetly, through multiple brokerages in batches small enough not to trigger automatic alerts, but in the aggregate, the position already represents an expressive volume. Valentina knew that pattern. It was the bet on the fall. Renato was preparing the ground to profit when the shares fell, which in turn depended on the market knowing that the Nexum acquisition had been a disaster. But the acquisition had been cancelled, so how did he intend to trigger the fall? "He's going to leak information," she said. "He's going to circulate the narrative that the Cavalcanti Group was close to a fraudulent acquisition, implying there was due diligence negligence or worse, complicity, enough to shake market confidence even without proving anything. And the short positions profit from the fall in shares." Exactly. Valentina closed her eyes for a moment to organize her thoughts. He lost the main operation but still has a plan B. He won't be able to take the energy concessions, but he can profit from the destruction of the group's reputation while fleeing the investigations. Marcos crossed his arms. "What do we do?" Valentina opened her eyes. There was a solution. She had seen this type of maneuver before, not to apply it, but to understand it. And if there was one thing the 3 years of silence had given her, it was time to think about the answers she had never been able to apply in time. "We let him bet," she said. Marcos frowned. "Explain." "If Renato is accumulating short positions expecting the shares to fall, the worst thing that can happen to him is for the shares to rise significantly and quickly. An expressive rise not only destroys the value of the short positions, but signals to the market that the group is solid. And how do we make the shares rise?" Valentina looked at Marcos with an expression he hadn't seen in her yet. Not the usual analytical coldness, but something close to satisfaction. "Augusto has a commercial partner in the renewable energy sector with whom he's been negotiating a joint venture for months, right?" "Yes, Solaris Group, a Norwegian company. The deal is advanced but hasn't been announced. We announce it tomorrow morning, before the market opens." The silence that followed contained the weight of someone understanding the reach of a move at once simple and devastating. A strategic partnership with a European renewable energy company. Exactly the kind of news the market loved, which communicated solidity, long-term vision, and access to international capital. "When the group's shares open with a rise, Renato's short positions will start to bleed," Valentina said. "The more the stock rises, the more he loses. And unlike Augusto, he has no way to protect himself quickly because the positions are spread across multiple accounts to not raise suspicion, which means unwinding them in a coordinated way will take time and cost dearly." Marcos nodded slowly. "You are proposing to use his move against him. I am proposing to reveal a true fact at the right moment so that reality does the work," Valentina said. "It's not manipulation, it's precision." She presented the strategy to Augusto that same afternoon. He listened without interrupting, with the concentrated attention of someone who had learned over 10 days to calibrate the weight of what this woman said. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Will Solaris agree to announce now?" "If you call today and explain the situation, yes. They also don't want to be associated with a shadow of uncertainty." A pause. "And the deal is good for them. The announcement now benefits them as much as it does you." Augusto picked up the phone. The call lasted 50 minutes. When it ended, he looked at Valentina and said, "Tomorrow at 6 in the morning, the joint statement goes to the press." Valentina nodded, and for the first time in a long time, she felt that the board was finally balanced. Not in her favor, not against her, but at a real point of equilibrium, where the pieces were where they should be. That night, sitting on a garden bench in a square near the simple apartment where she had lived for the last 3 years, Valentina stared at the clear sky over São Paulo. Rare, precious. She thought of everything she had sacrificed, her career, her name, the years. She thought of the mornings carrying trays and the looks that passed through her without landing, and she thought that maybe those 3 years weren't just a loss. Maybe they were preparation, slow, painful, necessary. The statement was going live in less than 12 hours. That square had been the only space Valentina allowed herself to frequent without calculating. In her 3 years of discreet living, she had built a routine of containment. The one-bedroom apartment in Ipiranga, the bus, the restaurant, back to the apartment. Outings without a destination were dangerous because they could lead to the kind of casual encounter that triggers recognition. But that square had a specific quality of anonymity. It was frequented by people who didn't look at each other, each carrying the particular weight of their own nights. She opened the notebook she carried in her backpack and spent another hour reviewing the documents she had prepared for the next morning's statement. Not because it was necessary, she had reviewed everything 3 times, but because the familiar movement of her fingers over the keyboard and her eyes over the numbers kept her anchored in a moment that had all the ingredients of emotional disintegration. 3 years of compression don't undo themselves in a single night. They needed to be managed like any other risk. There was an irony she recognized with some lightness. The same temperament that had made her so efficient in financial analysis, the ability to separate what she felt from what she needed to do, was the temperament that had kept her functional during the 3 years of invisibility. Some skills were portable in ways a person doesn't imagine when they develop them. She closed the notebook at 2 in the morning, put it in her backpack and stayed for another moment looking at the silent square. Then she stood up and went back to the apartment, knowing she would need at least 4 hours of sleep to be at the level of mind the next day would require. The market opened with Cavalcanti Group shares up 8.3%. In 40 minutes it reached 12. The joint statement with Solaris Group had been received exactly as Valentina had predicted, as a sign of strategic robustness at a time when vague rumors tried to suggest fragility. Valentina followed everything from a terminal in Marcos's office, with black coffee and the concentration of someone watching natural consequences unfold in real time. There was something almost technical in the satisfaction, not vengeful, but structural, like seeing an equation resolve in the correct direction. The short positions accumulated by Renato's network began to bleed immediately. Marcos had a direct line to the B3 monitoring department and received updates every 20 minutes. In 2 hours of trading, the estimated loss on the positions already exceeded the equivalent of 300 million reais, and it was growing with every positive variation of the stock. "He's going to try to liquidate the positions," Marcos said. "He must be trying already," Valentina said. "But since the positions are distributed across multiple accounts, coordinated liquidation will take time, and every hour it takes, the cost increases." At 10 in the morning, news arrived that Marcos received with an expression that for him amounted to visible surprise. One of the intermediaries used by the Meridian network to accumulate the short positions had voluntarily contacted the CVM, presenting documentation on the instructions received. It was the kind of move that happened when someone inside a structure realizes the boat is sinking and decides to swim to the nearest shore. Valentina read the report Marcos passed to her and was silent for a moment. One of the intermediaries flipped. "That opens the investigation on another level," Marcos said. "With voluntary testimony, the CVM has the basis to request a freeze on Meridian's assets while the investigation proceeds." The morning unfolded in movements that, seen from the outside, would seem chaotic, but which Valentina followed like musical scores she had, in a way, written in advance. Each event confirmed a prediction, each fold of the situation revealed the logic underneath. At 11:40, Augusto called her to his office. She entered and found him standing facing the window, with all of São Paulo before him on the clear winter horizon. He stood with his back turned for a moment before turning around. "Renato's positions have lost approximately half of their estimated value since the opening," he said, "and the intermediary who flipped presented documentation that includes direct communications with him. Not with Meridian, with him personally." Valentina nodded. It was the missing piece, not just the corporate structure, but the individual behind it. "The CVM is going to formalize the investigation," Augusto continued, "and the documentation you provided, including the backup with the comparison of financial architectures, will be a central part of the process." He paused. "This means your name will appear as a source of evidence, and that the investigation into you will need to be reviewed in light of everything that has emerged." "I know," she said. "You should have gone to the authorities sooner." It was a judgment, and she recognized it as such. But there was a story behind every decision that he hadn't lived. When authorities start an investigation based on a dossier assembled by the investigated party, it's hard to convince them the dossier is false without independent proof. I needed time to build that independence. She looked at him. "And I needed someone with enough power to believe in me before the authorities. You were that someone." Augusto was silent for a moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. You could have let the deal happen. You could have stayed invisible. No one would know you were there. I could have, she said. Why didn't you? Valentina thought for a genuine moment before answering. Because I already knew what happened when someone like Renato isn't stopped. I had already seen it, and staying silent this time would have been a choice, not a circumstance. Augusto nodded slowly, not as agreement but as recognition. It was a distinction that he, being the type of man he was, could appreciate. There's one more thing, he said. The group's financial systems need a serious reconstruction. The due diligence failed because there were structural holes in the verification processes, not just because of Clarissa, because of how the system was designed. He looked at her. I need someone who understands where those holes exist and how to close them. Valentina took a moment to understand what was being said. I am offering a position, Augusto said with the direct objectivity of someone who doesn't usually need to explain invitations. Director of Operations Integrity. You will have access to everything and authority to recommend any change you deem necessary. Valentina was silent for a moment. There was a strange weight in that, not of rejection but of needing to calibrate what it meant to accept. For 3 years, she had lived with the weight of invisibility. Accepting that position was the radical opposite of that. I need the regulatory situation regarding my name to be resolved first, she said. I cannot assume any formal position while there are pending accusations. I understand. But formally, the offer is here. Valentina nodded. It was enough for now. Outside, São Paulo continued, indifferent, enormous, full of people who would never know what had happened during those days in that tower. And there was something liberating in that indifference. The city didn't need to know. What mattered had happened in the right rooms with the right people at the right time. She went back to Marcos's terminal and worked for the rest of the day, following the developments with the attention of someone who still cannot afford the luxury of letting go of the helm. At 2 o'clock that same afternoon, a final piece of information arrived that Marcos considered irrelevant, but that Valentina kept with attention. A report from the internal legal team indicated that Renato Salave's lawyers had requested a hearing with the regulators to present clarifications on unfounded accusations. It was the move of someone trying to build a defensive narrative before the offensive consolidated completely. Valentina read the report and felt something that wasn't exactly satisfaction. It was closer to the recognition of a familiar pattern. Renato had always been better at attacking than defending. When he was on the offensive, he was formidable. On the defensive, he resorted to the same moves as always: discredit the source, question the methodology, invoke credentials. It was effective against common adversaries. It was not effective against someone who had studied his methods for 4 years and spent another 3 years reflecting on each of them. The request for a hearing will be denied, she said to Marcos. The CVM doesn't usually receive investigated parties before consolidating the initial material. He knows that. He's making the gesture to build the later argument that he was not given the opportunity for defense. And was he? Marcos said. The defense comes later in the formal process. What he's doing now is politics, not legal. She closed the report. Let him. Every move he makes in that direction is a move he's not making in the other. Marcos nodded and went back to the monitors. Valentina stared out the window for a moment before returning to work. There was something in the closing of that day that had a different quality from all the previous days. It wasn't victory. Victory would come later, with the formal dismissal of the charges, with the signing of the contract, with the plaque on the office. What there was at that moment was something else. The perception that the path ahead was real, that there was ground beneath her feet, where before there had only been the hope that ground existed. 6 months later, Valentina Suarez signed the contract as Director of Operations Integrity for the Cavalcanti Group in an office that had her name on a plaque outside, small, discreet, but present. The CVM investigation had been concluded with the formal review of the charges against her. The evidence presented conclusively demonstrated that the documents used to incriminate her had been altered, and the case was archived with a note of innocence recorded in the process. Renato Salave had his assets preventively frozen while the investigation took its course. Meridian Capital Advisors was dissolved by court order. and Waitress Solutions was subjected to a compulsory audit. The hearings had been following one another with the characteristic slowness of regulatory processes, but they were advancing, which was what mattered. Clarissa Wendt cooperated fully with the investigation and was removed from her position during the process. Her future was uncertain, but she had chosen transparency while there was still time to choose, which counted for something. Valentina discovered over time that the hardest part had not been the 3 years of invisibility, nor the night she had said 5 words to a man who used her to make a joke. The hardest part had been the moment immediately after, when the situation had become real and she had needed to keep functioning with precision while all the accumulated weight of 3 years tried to make her falter. She had not faltered. On the night she signed the contract, Valentina stayed in the office after everyone had gone. She stood before the window overlooking the illuminated Faria Lima below, that same avenue she had crossed dozens of times carrying trays, without anyone around knowing who she was. Now they knew. And she also knew, with a clarity the 3 years had forged, who she was regardless of any position, any recognition, any window with a view of the city. She was someone who had learned the difference between being invisible and being underestimated, and who had used exactly that difference as the most precise tool she possessed. In her first months in the new position, Valentina rebuilt the group's due diligence verification protocol from scratch. It wasn't work done in meetings, it was done in silent hours before spreadsheets and records, mapping each point of vulnerability that had allowed the Nexum operation to get so far without being detected. She found 7 different structural flaws, all documented, all accompanied by concrete correction proposals that were implemented over 3 months. Augusto rarely commented directly on her work, but there was a specific quality in the silence with which he received her reports, the silence of someone who reads with real attention, not out of obligation, that she had learned to recognize as his way of saying the work mattered. One afternoon, months after assuming the position, she crossed paths with Diego Furtado in the hallway, the same Diego who had pointed at her in the restaurant and suggested Augusto ask for the waitress's opinion. He saw her with the expression of someone still recalibrating what it meant to find this person in this context. She greeted him by name, naturally, and kept going. There was nothing to settle with Diego. He had done what people in his position frequently do, used the available hierarchy as an instrument of easy wit. The mistake had been his, but the opportunity had been created by him too, involuntarily, without intention, which made the result even more precise as an irony. Valentina had stopped a long time ago, attributing malicious intention to what could be explained by indifference. Indifference was the default state of those who don't need to think about the consequences of their gestures for others. It was neither virtue nor vice. It was simply what happened when one had enough power not to be corrected. The world was full of Diegos, and the world was full of Valentinas who never found the right table at the right time. She knew that. She knew her story contained elements of chance that could not be converted into a formula or a portable lesson. The question was not how to replicate what had happened, it was what to do with the space that had been recovered. She chose to do real work, everyday real work, the kind of work that builds something that stays after the person goes away. It was enough. She discovered, with some surprise, it was exactly enough. It was the awareness that some stories don't end with a public statement or formal recognition. They end with a private, silent moment that belongs only to the one who lived it. The city blinked outside. São Paulo never completely slept. There was always enough light to see where one was and to remember that the darkness was never total. Valentina took a deep breath and smiled, a small smile, without an audience, just for her. It was enough. There was a scene Valentina revisited frequently in the following months, not with nostalgia, but with the analytical attention she applied to any relevant data. The moment she had placed the tray on the restaurant table and walked toward the elevator with Augusto Cavalcanti. She had left that shift without warning the manager, without taking the last tips of the night, without saying goodbye to any of the colleagues with whom she had shared 18 months of shifts and coffee breaks. She had simply left. She learned later that the manager had tried to locate her in the following days. Then he had filled the vacancy with someone else. Eclat continued functioning exactly as before. The silver cutlery, the imported porcelain, the billion-dollar deals discussed out loud in front of people who supposedly didn't have enough vocabulary to understand. Valentina bore no grudge against the place. The restaurant had fulfilled its function. It had been the convergence point of 3 years of preparation and 1 night of precision. There was no way to ask for more from a setting. If Valentina's story touched something in you, the courage of someone who waits in silence without losing purpose, the precision of someone who acts at the exact moment, then you know that some stories deserve to be heard more than once. We have a complete playlist with narratives that explore the same themes: identity, starting over, justice, and the silent strength of those who never gave up on themselves. You can find it right here, beside you. If this journey was worth your time, leave your like. It tells us we're on the right track. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the next chapters of stories like this, and tell us in the comments, what was the moment that most gripped you in Valentina's story? We read every comment. Until the next story. End of story.